Welcome to the Your Innovation Coach webinar. Today's topic is how to prevent overloading of development resources. And before we start, I want to make the point that this topic related to resource allocation and overloading of resources and so forth is a very common problem in every company. And there's lots of survey data that backs this up. Consistently year in and year out, around 2/3 of people surveyed in companies will say that they have way too many projects for the resources. And it's just a very common problem. I think it's just human nature. We tend to be too optimistic in thinking about what we can accomplish with the resources that we've got. New product development is unlike any other process in the business in the sense that every project is different. It's not routine work. Every other process really in the business is more standardized type processes, which is it's much easier to plan for the resources when the process is repeatable, whereas new product development is not like that. So we tend to end up with way too many projects for the resources that we've got available. So it's a very common problem. Kind of on the flip side, or related to that, is the fact that around 25% will say that they are actually good at planning for resources. So on the opposite, 75% say they are not good at that, and that's a major challenge. At least from my experience in managing new product development, that was, in my opinion, was always the most difficult sub-process to really do well, and we're going to talk about that today. There's a lot of risk when you overload the resources within the project portfolio. Number one is late projects, and it's not just related to one project, but it's every project in the portfolio can be impacted when something goes wrong in one project. And to make this point, I use this graph here. On the left side is the percent risk of project delay in one or multiple of your projects within the portfolio, and on the x-axis is the percent of resource loading. It's my contention that as you approach 100% loading on your resources in new product development, you start to get to the point where there's 100% risk, in my opinion, that one or multiple of your projects in the portfolio are going to get delayed. And the reason that's the case is because of the interdependencies of projects. It's very unusual for a person to work on one project. Typically in your organization, if you look at the folks that are involved with new product development, they are not just working on one project, they are multitasking across several projects. And so you take that one person, multiply it by the number of people in the organization across all the different projects, and every project is interrelated to other projects. So if something happens on one project, it gets delayed, or there's a technical issue, or whatever happens, it can have knock-on effects on the other projects. And so if you're loaded at 100%, there's just no slack in the system. And so you run the risk, really a high risk, that every project in the portfolio is impacted in some way. So as you continue to load the resources, add more projects, it just compounds on itself, and you really can't get out of it. So in a lot of cases, what I do with companies is look at their project portfolio, and it may mean, in order to get out of this treadmill, so to speak, that you have to cut out some projects that you're working on. It's the only way to kind of triage the situation and get it back into some kind of normal flow of work that lines up with the resources. This curve, I think, will look different for every company. This inflection point will be different. It's going to be based on the technology, the scope of the projects, how long the projects are, the complexity of the project. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. Certainly, you don't want to be down here necessarily, but again, the risk is really high when you get up to 100% of loading. I think the other point here is that this is, again, there's a drive in our organizations for maximum efficiency in everything that we do. And that translates to new product development. Slack in the system in terms of resources is not viewed positively in organizations because we're driving for maximum efficiency. And we believe, I think wrongly, that if there is any slack in the system for developing new products, that's a bad thing, and that we want to make sure that everybody is maximized to their maximum percent so that we're not wasting money. But there's a trade-off. There's a sweet spot in terms of how loaded you are, and really it depends on how important it is for you for the projects to be on time. So you do pay a penalty when you're up at 100% in terms of late projects, and so you just have to have that expectation. And the only way to really get out of that is to have some slack in the system. So you really can't have it both ways. You can't have multiple projects of any complexity running in your organization and load at 100% and expect that everything is always going to be on time. It's just an unrealistic expectation. And this is based on my experience as well as of experience of really any other company that does this type of, that develops new products. So the other risk is because projects are late, it means you can't innovate fast enough. Time to market gets longer. That's a real problem. The project costs go up because the projects go longer. You might miss opportunities as a result, and of course, ultimately, you may have dissatisfied customers. So there's a lot of risk when you overload the resources. So what we're going to talk about today are some really 8 practical rules to help prevent this situation. And before we dive into these 8, I'll make a couple points to you. First, the discussion today is going to assume that you have some process in place to actually pick the right projects. That's an important process. It's really what we term the project portfolio planning type process. And you have to have some way to decide what project is higher priority and what's lower priority. You might rank it from 1 to X. You might group projects in A, B, and C. However you do it, you have to have some way to delineate. And if you don't have any process in place, you are making those decisions. It probably is just based on hallway conversations, and it may change daily. So all of this discussion really assumes that you have a good process in place to pick the right projects. And now we're talking about trying to manage our resources to get as much through the system as possible. The second point is that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today I've incorporated in the past in my talks and my workshops and what I do with clients. However, this framework is based off of this resource, Chapter 2 in particular, and I like this framework. It puts a little context into it. I think it also is a nice framework in the sense that this is really kind of in order of priority. In other words, if you're struggling with overloaded resources, then you really need to start at the top of this list and work your way down. There might be some of these down lower that I might reorder in terms of priority, but clearly the first 3 are the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and that's where you can gain probably 80% of the benefit in terms of getting a handle on this vexing problem. So with that, let's go ahead and start with the first one, and that has to do with thinking about your key development resources and how many projects they're working on, and to limit those projects. And to make the point here, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when we multitask, which is a very common issue within most every organization. If you look at one person who has to work on 3 tasks, and each task is 10 days, and they're prioritized, let's say, in this fashion, where the person, if they can work nonstop on A, it takes them 10 days, B, 10 days, and C, 10 days. That's normally not the reality. The reality is that we can't work linearly on these 3 tasks, that suddenly the project manager responsible for project B or task B suddenly starts demanding more time and that they need something done. So that means the person working on task A puts that down and starts working on task B. The same thing happens with task C. So that person ends up going back and forth between these 3 tasks. And there's a couple of things that happen you'll notice. First of all, every task takes longer. Now rather than 10 days, they take 20 days. At least 2 tasks take longer than scheduled. So the A task gets extended, as does the B task. The only one that theoretically comes in on time is the C task. But I would contend it's even worse than that, because the fact is, this is assuming that if you're multitasking, that these tasks still take 10 days, but that's really not realistic because of what we call switching costs. And this is really intuitive. If you think about doing a high complex task, let's say task A, and you get through it a certain amount, in this case 5 days, and you put it down and you have to come back to it several days later, you just can't reconstitute where you were mentally with that task. So rather than that task taking 10 days, I would contend it probably takes longer. So that means this entire timeline really goes out further. So there's a big task that we pay in multitasking, and it's a very common problem. So what you need to think about really critically is, especially on your key content providers, how many projects they're working on simultaneously. And this graph makes the point. There's a lot of data out there that supports this, but on the y-axis is time value added. So it's high time value added results that are on the y-axis versus the number of projects that somebody is working on concurrently. So it's a curvilinear type response. So it's not necessarily good to have a person working on one project. If you've ever worked on projects, you know that invariably through the life of the project, there are times when you're waiting for something to happen. Maybe you're getting parts made and you're waiting for them to come in order to prove out a prototype, and you really can't go any further until you answer some questions. So there are always things that you're waiting on. So that may not be the most efficient use of the resource for sure. On the other end of the spectrum, though, is more common, and that is we tend to expect our key content providers to work on multiple projects. And that has a downside, because you end up, because of this issue with multitasking, being less effective in terms of being able to work on those projects. So the ideal sweet spot really is a couple of projects per development resource. That's a good way to kind of balance out the load, so to speak, and it's really the most effective use of the resource. Any more than that, typically you're going to start paying the price, the downside related to multitasking. I'll make a couple other points on this. First is that you can delineate between types of resources. This is certainly true on certain key content providers, especially engineers, software engineers, mechanical engineers, etc. Not necessarily as true in my experience with some other types of resources like technicians and so forth. They can more easily switch back and forth between different projects. You don't have the same switching costs. So that's the first point. The second point is it's important to think about the phase of the project. So even if somebody is working on two projects, if they're both exactly in the same phase of development, for instance, maybe they're both in a kind of the end of the phase where you're moving a product into manufacturing or a product from manufacturing into the market, that's a high intensity type of situation. And if that person is working on two projects that are in that same phase, then that could be a problem as well, depending on the scope of the projects. So this is not, you have to think about that issue as well. It's better really to try to, if they are working on two projects, one is in the early phase, one is in a more critical later phase. So you have to think about critical paths and where they are in the phases. Okay, so after you've kind of thought about that and tried to triage that, and it may, like I said, the only way to get out of that may be, you can't do it instantaneously, but certainly over time you can start to try to get a handle on that particular issue. And then that leads to the second one, and that's really that the priorities relative to the projects really have to be clear and relatively stable over time. And the only way really to be able to do that is to have some type of a portfolio process, some way that you pick what projects are higher priority and vet that out so that those priorities stay relatively constant over time. It doesn't mean that you never change your mind, but if you're constantly changing your mind on projects day in and day out, then you will never be able to manage the resources. So those priorities have to be relatively stable over time. So what happens is, in the worst case, you revert to this concept of multitasking. So if you assume that there's one person here that's working on 3 different tasks on 3 different projects, if there's no prioritization in the business about those 3 projects, then you just end up in this multitasking world, so to speak, with all of the unintended consequences that brings. So a better case is that at least you prioritize those projects, and those priorities are relatively stable, so you're not switching back and forth every day. And so task 1 is higher priority than task 2 is higher priority than task 3. So, of course, this is in the perfect world. It doesn't necessarily work out like that all the time. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the point is that, you need to make sure that you have some stable priorities. Otherwise, you're going to end up back in this issue with multitasking. So again, that kind of reverts back to this concept of the project portfolio planning and how you're doing that and vetting that out so that there's this sub-process that's running parallel to your resource allocation process that, is vetting out those projects and you're debating what's higher and what's lower priority. All right, so you've addressed this. You've got something in place to keep, to vet out the priorities and keep them constant. The third thing is then very important, and that is to have some type of a resource allocation process. And in my experience, companies kind of fall along a spectrum of either they do nothing here and hope for the best, or they put in right off the bat some very heavy-handed, intense process that has way too much granularity and overburdens the organizations, that people get frustrated with it, and then it falls apart and no one uses it. You go out and spend a lot of money on a very sophisticated enterprise level software, and it really doesn't solve your problem because it's too heavy-handed. So what I'm going to show you is, if you don't have anything in place, what I recommend are very simple tools. You can do this with Excel, not very complicated, pretty intuitive. You can also do it with things like Microsoft Project, but actually I find that the technique I'm going to show you is actually really a little easier, I think, than doing it through something like Project. So it's a very simple spreadsheet. Of course, let's go to this this worksheet first, and that is that really all of this discussion, the way you typically start out is you've got multiple projects that you're working on or planning for, and you've got your resources down here, your key resources that you really want to try to manage. I'll come back to that here in a minute, but and so you're, as project managers, you're thinking about these projects. Maybe project 1 and 2 are going on right now, and you've got people that are tasked with those projects. You're thinking about projects that are coming in the future and which of these resources really have to work on those future projects. So you're always thinking about how the teams are going to get constituted, and of course that's a first step in thinking through the resource allocation process. But at some point you got to think about the projects and lining up those resources and trying to figure out what kind of loading on the system that you've got. So in this worksheet, we're looking at resource allocation by project. So down the left side here is project 1, 2, on down through the spreadsheet, and then lined up under each project are the resources that you're trying to plan for. Now you might choose not to put in, for instance, I've got CAD resources. That might not be something, again, because you don't want every resource in there. If there's not a lot of switching costs, then really over time you'll get a feel for the load on those kind of resources, and you can manage those a little easier. But really what we're talking about here are the key resources that you don't want to necessarily load at more than 2 projects, because if you go beyond that, you start running this risk of multitasking and what it's going to do to the entire portfolio of projects. So in project 1, and then of course on the top axis here, along the top is some kind of timeline. Here I've got it divided by quarters and years. it depends on the scope of your projects. This might, if your projects are months-long projects, then it might be more appropriate to do this by weeks. So it just depends on the length of your projects. You can scale this however it is appropriate for your business. And then just a graphical illustration of the anticipated phase schedule for the project. So I've broken this down into the phases. This is typically most companies use phase gate. Again, that's out of the context of what we're talking about today, but this is kind of where the project is from a development standpoint. And then you've got the various resources that are working on the project. And so if you look at this resource number one, this mechanical engineer, the data in red here is how much time they actually spent on that project in these past quarters. So this is real data, so to speak, and then the data in black basically is project manager working with the resource, thinking about what has to be done yet on the project, and projecting out that loading, by quarter in this case. And in terms of collecting this data, it doesn't have to be really heavy-handed. I mean, you could implement some type of a time card. I don't think it's necessary to do that on a daily basis. Again, depending on the scope of the project, really is going to drive how often you collect the data. When I did this, as I was collecting data on a quarterly basis, we did weekly type of accounting. It was basically just asking the resource to go back over the course of the week and get a rough estimate on how much time they spent on the various projects. So you don't have to go really overboard in terms of collecting this data. It really doesn't matter, in my opinion, whether this person spent 55% or 52 or 58. That's really not the point. I think plus or minus 5% is probably close enough in terms of granularity. You're really just looking at that kind of level, I think. But as a manager, it's really important because you can, if suddenly this goes down, projected down to 5%, you're going to ask why. Or if it goes up to 90%, you're going to ask why. But it's a really nice way to make it visible. Of course, as time goes on in the project, you get better at projecting it. So, at the beginning of the project, sometimes it's difficult. And that's what makes this challenging, especially on early phase projects, to project out what the loading is going to be. And that, frankly, is one of the most difficult things to do. But you have to start somewhere, and this is, I found, the best way to do it. So you can do this for the project on all the resources, and then if you come all the way down, you consolidate all that data, and then down at the bottom you can look at individuals now and consolidate the data from the projects that they're working on and get a feel for the loading on that resource. So here, ME number one, spent around 90 to 95% of his time or her time. This is the projected out, and then the significance of the yellow is I basically just use that as a subjective way to graphically illustrate when the resources were going to start to get freed up, so to speak, in order to work on other projects. And then, of course, you're thinking about the future projects and the teams and how to synchronize the work. So this is just a spreadsheet that's constantly being looked at in terms of trying to anticipate where you're going to go with the with projects and the resources and the timing and all that good stuff. So that's allocation by project, and then allows you to consolidate that by person and look at the overall loading. And then the other thing you can do with the data is have a separate one for allocation by resource. So now here you've got individuals, and then here are the projects. Same timeline up here, and now you can look at per resource where they're spending their time. And you'll notice here that this person is working on 2 projects. You'll also notice something very important, and that is on every resource you really need to have what I would call general support or overhead or whatever you want to call it in terms of their time. The reality is that no one can spend 100% of their time at work on value-added tasks. It's just unrealistic. We have that expectation sometimes, but it doesn't work that way. Whether it's vacations that people have or other loads on their time. For instance, some senior people might have a lot of legacy knowledge that's important to the organization. So they are constantly being asked by, for instance, manufacturing or other parts of the organization to help them on problems. So, depending on the person and how much load they've got on there between vacations and meetings and general support to other parts of the organization, you have to think about this and be very careful about thinking that they have less time. And again, by doing some accounting, you start to get a feel, if on a weekly basis a person is telling you that they are spending half of their time on that kind of stuff, then it's very important in terms of what assumptions you're going to make on these projects. So it's a way to make that explicit in thinking about how much time people really have for value added. And if you think that you're going to really load people at 125% because you're really expecting them, what that means is you're expecting them to work more than 8 hours a day, you can do that. But, there are a lot of unintended consequences. If the organization is being run such that people are expected to work 12-hour days every day, day in and day out, there are a lot of consequences for that, managing the organization like that as well. Okay, so this is a very straightforward process, I think. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of assumptions that you're making, but it's certainly a great way to start and have a purposeful discussion within the business about these types of topics. You have to start somewhere. If you have nothing in place, then this is a way to do that. All right. So, as I mentioned, I think before we go further, if you deal with these first three, you are probably 80% of the way through addressing the problem. The rest of these down here, I think, are icing on the cake, so to speak. But I would definitely, if you're having problems with this, if you haven't thought about these three things first, then that's where you need to spend your time dealing with that, and then these things can be added in over time. So let's go to the fourth one, the use of what's called time slices for shared resources. So, if you go back to this concept of a person working on three tasks and multitasking across those three, that there are lots of dangers associated with that. A better case is that at least you prioritize, you have global priority, so to speak, in terms of the task, so you divide up the work that way. But there is another way, kind of a best case, where, the content provider here, the person that's working on these three tasks, is working with the project manager on these three different tasks, and they come up with a way to synchronize the work, reduce the time batches of the tasks that have to be done, break it up into some logical chunks, and do it purposefully so that you're not just multitasking, but you're breaking things up into chunks where you can spend a couple days on this task and then hand that off to somebody else and then go on to this task. So if you break up the work into smaller chunks and synchronize it with the other content providers, then this will work. It's not like multitasking, but you can break it up and you keep all three projects moving forward, because really the reality is that if you do it strictly on this fashion, this lower priority task is always going to get shortchanged on resources. So there is a way to do it better by breaking these tasks up into smaller chunks, figuring out how to synchronize the work, and reducing the risk of just inadvertent multitasking across all those tasks. The fifth concept is the use of what are called common time slices. So this gets back to the concept that no matter what you do, many of the resources in your business, especially your more senior people with a lot of legacy knowledge, they will constantly get bombarded by many people in the organization for help. Whether it's coming in from manufacturing, whether it's coming in from sales folks, from the distribution chain, from customers, from management, from other folks and other functional groups, they are constantly bombarded by email, by phone, by people coming into their office requiring immediate assistance. And that is just a fact of life in all of our organizations. So it's a very difficult situation to manage. You know, what we've been talking about up to this point are all project-related type of tasks. Here, what we're talking about now are interruptions to your workflow outside of the project work. Okay, so one potential way to handle this is what would be termed the daily common project work time. And the way this would be implemented is that you have a common, say, 2-hour time slot that's allocated exclusively to value creating work. So what you have to do during this 2-hour time frame is that you basically make sure that you schedule no meetings for people. You know, it might be a project team that might want to meet by themselves, but no big meetings is scheduled where, you know, you got to go to a meeting, whether it's at the company level or whether it's a project-related type of thing. Incoming calls go to voicemail. You don't leave voicemails for other people. You don't manage email. You don't answer email. You don't send email. And throughout the organization, walk-in interruptions are discouraged. So the idea is to try to set aside a 2-hour slot where people know that they can do high-intensity, value-added work during this same 2-hour slot day in and day out. They know they're going to have that time. So to implement something like that, first of all, you would have to synchronize it throughout the business. It cannot just be the development personnel, but really all the functions that relate to the development personnel. So maybe the manufacturing organization, maybe the product management or marketing organization. You know, we'll come to some of the challenges, and you know, there might be some exceptions related to customer-facing personnel. But you really have to implement it across the company. Third, it's very important that while it might come up from the grassroots in terms of, you know, a content provider, an engineer, or some other employee might come up with this idea and want to implement it, it really has to be supported and driven by senior management, because unless that senior manager, you know, agrees with it and supports it, first time that a key customer calls the president or the CEO, then they go directly to a content provider, and then the organization understands, well, this is really not that important, right? You know, there are exceptions that that we make, and so, you know, and it becomes a, you know, a situation where it's a double standard. You know, if the CEO wants it done, then it doesn't make any sense, but if somebody else wants it done, well, that's fine. So it really has to be something that's supported by senior management. It's probably important to have some type of written communication outlining the purpose. The reference I mentioned to you before has a nice template that you can start with. It's just a simple, single-page type of document. There are always going to be rules and exceptions, and every company is probably going to have to go through some gyrations in order to get it right, to make it work for them. There are some challenges. You know, every company pretty much has some functional groups that are customer-facing, so this interaction with customers becomes an issue. You know, how you manage that. It may be that your customer support folks, they get calls from customers. You can't shut that down, but they just have to kind of wait during that period to make sure before they start sending emails or calling people to get help on a particular situation. So that, you know, that's where some of the exceptions might come in terms of customers. And we'll come back to those kind of interruptions and customer issues here in a minute. The other thing is organization entropy, and that is that unless you continually emphasize this process, particularly at the senior management level, and renew it periodically and discuss it within the organization, and maybe reintroduce it from time to time, re-emphasize it, then it's just going to go away, because the exceptions will become the rule, and then it will just wither away. So you really have to be committed to make this work. But I believe it has a lot of validity to try this and see if it will work. Okay, the sixth kind of rule or practical tip here, it has to do with economic impact and how that will drive your real-time priority decisions. If we go back to when we were talking about rule number 2, where you want to move from a multitasking environment at least to prioritizing work based on the global priority list, so to speak. Um, Again, lower priority tasks will tend to always get shortchanged. So there might be ways to nuance the decision making about what takes priority. And so there are some, in this rule, some arbitration rules that are kind of a refinement of rule number 2. And so to illustrate this, we'll make a couple assumptions. We'll assume that an engineer is working on 2 projects and has competing tasks. So at this particular point in time, a decision has to be made. What task is that person going to work on? The 2 tasks, project A is actually higher priority in the global list compared to project B. So these are the assumptions that we've got going into this. So rule number 6.1 is, let's first assume that one of those tasks is on the critical path of that project, where the other task is non-schedule critical. So in that case, the task on the critical path wins regardless of the project priority. So in other words, if the critical path is on project B, even though project A is higher, the decision is you work on project B task. Okay, so that's kind of a nuanced way to look at it based on economic impact, basically. Rule 6.2 is, let's assume that both tasks at that point are on the critical path. Then you revert back and you look at which, if you don't work on a task, which project would suffer the greatest economic impact. Now, economic impact is kind of a nebulous type of concept. It really relates to schedule sensitivity. So there might be, for instance, project B might be a seasonal project or product, and there might be a lot of schedule sensitivity at that particular point in time. So you got to nuance it. Maybe in the past you would have made a different decision, but today you're going to decide that you know what, you got to work on project B rather than project A for these reasons. But you have a specific discussion, project manager and other key folks in the organization to make that decision. So you're taking into account critical or economic impact in this case. 6.3, rule 6.3 is, you assume that neither task is on the critical path, and then you can just simply revert to the global priority to determine which task is higher priority. And then finally, if you assume that both projects are pretty close in priority and economic impact, then you just revert to whichever task is the shortest and knock that off first. Okay, the next topic is this concept of managing walk-in requests, which is a really common problem. I referenced it back here on the common time slices. Much of what we talked about up here really has to do with managing the flow of your normal project work. But walk-in requests is a big load on the organization, and it relates back to when we were up here on the resource allocation process in that line item for every resource on terms of general support. So walk-in requests can come from anywhere. They can come from the factory in terms of manufacturing support. They can be customer issues. They can be special orders, maybe proposals and quotes, all kinds of other loads on that resource. All this stuff is really what constitutes that general support line within that resource allocation spreadsheet. So you really got to think about that, and if all of these requirements are going directly to the resource, then you have no control over that. And really, it's really better to think of all this stuff and flowing it through a focal point. And really, the best person to do this is whoever's managing that pool of resources. And then they look at these requests in terms of performing some triage. What's the urgency? Who really has to do this? Maybe manufacturing is coming and saying, hey, I need this person to do this. But the manager knows that, well, there's somebody else that can do this. They actually have more time right now, so rather than going to this particular person that the manufacturing wanted, we're gonna use have another resource do this because it's really better use of the resources. So the point is that there needs to be some purposeful decision making in terms of where these requests go, and to try to short circuit this process from here down to the resource. And then the resource pool manager then can assign the work based on availability, who really can do the work, and the impact on other high priority development projects. So if you're not managing this in some way and all this stuff is flowing directly to the resources, you basically have no control over how you're going to manage the resources. At the beginning, if you're having a big problem with this, you may have to make some very hard decisions about cutting all this off, cutting all these requests from going directly to the resources, but flowing it through here. And then maybe over time you can relax that a little bit, but you have to get a hold of this if it's a big problem. And in many companies, it is a very significant problem. Okay, and the final point I want to make is thinking about your workflow and managing in smaller time increments. It kind of goes back to this concept of time slices for shared resources, where you break up the workflow into smaller chunks, and that's really what we're talking about here. And it really kind of relates to thinking about what we do in manufacturing with just-in-time and managing inventory, so to speak, versus what we do in new product development, and to try to achieve flow in new product development like we try to achieve flow in the manufacturing process. So in the manufacturing world, your inventory is what we're talking about here. Your inventory in new product development basically is time and information. That's the inventory that we're trying to manage. And just like we try to break the tasks up and so forth into smaller chunks in manufacturing in order to achieve flow, you can do the same thing in new product development by how you break up the workflow. This really, I'm going to kind of use this as a teaser for another session, because I think this probably warrants a whole separate session on really applying some of the lean methodologies to project management. So you can use that concept to break workflow down and look at how you can divide up the work into smaller chunks purposefully, not just haphazardly, but in a purposeful way in order to allow you to achieve flow through the system. You might use, for instance, 15-minute stand-up project meetings, daily project meetings, rather than waiting to the end of the week. So that's one way to implement some of these lean processes. So again, I'll put that aside for the moment. It is something to think about in terms of how you manage workflow, and I think we'll come back to that in a future session. Okay, so I want to thank you. We went over a lot of information today. Here's my contact information, and I look forward to you participating in the next webinar. Have a great day. Thanks.